Romans chapter 7 opens in the middle of a sustained theological argument. Paul is writing to the believers gathered in Rome, a community shaped by both Jewish and Gentile backgrounds, and he has spent the preceding chapters tracing the entangled relationship between sin, death, and the Mosaic law. By the opening of chapter 7, he has already argued that the baptized believer has died to sin and is no longer under the law as once experienced. His readers might draw a conclusion that Paul himself anticipates. If the law is so closely associated with sin and death, is the law itself the problem? Is the law sin? It is precisely to that question that Paul turns at verse 7, and the answer he gives is as clear as anything in the epistle. The verse reads, "What then shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means, yet if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. For I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, 'You shall not covet.'" The denial is clear. The law is not sin. But Paul does not stop there. He identifies the law as the very means by which sin is known, and he reaches immediately for a concrete example, the 10th commandment, given first in Exodus chapter 20, "You shall not covet." This commandment concerns not an outward act, but the inward inclination of desire itself. Paul's testimony is unambiguous. Without this word of the law, he would not have recognized covetousness for what it was. This is the point that Socinian found decisive. The verse establishes something that carries far-reaching consequences. Moral knowledge is not innate. It does not arise spontaneously from human nature, requiring no instruction, no divine word, no external command. Some have argued, then and since, that every person knows by nature that one ought not to act wickedly, and that this natural knowledge is sufficient to ground universal accountability. But Paul's own testimony directly refutes that position. He would not have known covetousness unless the law had named it. The knowledge came from outside, from the divine command, not from within. This matters profoundly for how guilt and accountability are understood. If knowing what sin is requires the law's instruction, then where that instruction has not reached, sin cannot be charged. Paul makes this explicit elsewhere in the same letter, writing in chapter 5 that sin was indeed in the world before the law, but sin is not counted where there is no law. The structure of accountability runs from revelation to knowledge to responsibility. God is one, the sole giver of law, and it is precisely this divine word that constitutes the standard by which human beings can know what they have done and what is required of them. Christ himself speaks to the same truth in the 15th chapter of John, telling his disciples that had he not come and spoken to them, they would not have been guilty of sin. Knowledge precedes culpability. Revelation is not optional but foundational. Socinian weaves these threads into a coherent whole. The law is holy because it expresses the will of the one God, and Christ is the one whom God sent as mediator and teacher, not to satisfy a penalty incurred before any person could know what sin was, but to make God's will fully known and to confirm, through his own obedient life and death, that the path of faithful human existence is real and walkable. The law teaches what sin is. Christ teaches how to turn from it and live. Those who read this verse within a Trinitarian framework tend toward a different conclusion. On that reading, Paul's account of learning what covetousness was through the law is taken as a window onto a condition of radical, inherited sinfulness that no law can cure. The law reveals only so that it may condemn, and the passage becomes a demonstration of total human inability, preparing the ground for a doctrine of substitutionary atonement in which Christ absorbs the punishment the law pronounces on all. The eye of Paul's narrative becomes universal, the representative of fallen humanity unable to be otherwise. But the text resists this construction. Paul does not say that the law is unable to teach, or that he was unable to learn. He says he would not have known. The movement is from ignorance to knowledge, a movement made possible by the law speaking. That is a pedagogical function, not merely a condemning one. To import total depravity and universal hereditary guilt into a verse whose entire logic depends on the law's capacity to communicate and to instruct is to work against the grain of Paul's own argument. He goes on in the 12th verse of the same chapter to say plainly that the law is holy and the commandment holy, righteous, and good. A thing whose only operation is condemnation without instruction is not what Paul calls holy and good. The Socinian reading stands closer to the text at every point. The law reveals sin because sin requires knowledge to be known as sin. God is one, and that one God gave a law designed to teach. Christ is the commissioned mediator sent by that one God to confirm what the law pointed toward, to speak and demonstrate the will of God, and to show by his own obedience that human beings can indeed hear, understand, and follow. Accountability rests on knowledge, knowledge rests on revelation, and revelation is the gift of the one who alone is God. Paul's witness in Romans 7 is not a confession of helpless, innate corruption, but a testimony to the indispensable work of divine instruction. The word that names what was otherwise unnamed and opens the way through Christ toward what God has always willed for human life. In closing, I want to encourage you, examine for yourself, search diligently, read the scriptures with an open and rational mind. Socinianism does not rest on tradition or church authority, but on the conviction that God's truth is rational, clear, and morally sublime. If this perspective has resonated with you and you wish to explore the biblical Unitarian view further, visit www.socinianismus.tv for in-depth articles, studies, and reflections on central theological questions. If this video has been helpful, please support this work with a like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another contribution on the unity of God, the teaching of Jesus, and the rational interpretation of Scripture. Until the next video.